I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
It was a Tuesday in early November, the kind of day where the New York wind feels like it's trying to peel the skin off your face, which made the inside of the brownstone on West 35th Street feel even more like a fortress than usual. I was at my desk, finishing a report on a missing industrialist's daughter who turned out to be spending her father's hard-earned cash in a villa in Nice, when the doorbell rang. Since Wolfe was upstairs in the plant rooms, having a heart-to-heart with an odontoglossum that was being temperamental, it was my job to see who was brave enough to disturb the peace. When I opened the door, I didn't see a diamond tycoon or a frantic parent. I saw a man who looked like he had been living in a cellar for 3 decades. He was short, stooped, and wearing a coat that had lost its original color somewhere during the Truman administration. He clutched a leather portfolio to his chest as if it were a shield. "My name is Percival Glynn," he said, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering on a sidewalk. "I must see Mr. Nero Wolfe. It is a matter of historical integrity, and perhaps survival." "Survival is a big word for a Tuesday morning, Mr. Glynn," I told him, ushering him into the front room. "Mr. Wolfe is currently engaged with his orchids. He doesn't descend until 11, and he doesn't take cases involving old paper unless there's a very healthy bank balance attached to it." "The money is of no consequence," Glynn whispered, sitting on the edge of a chair as if he expected it to bite him. "The Glynn archives are at stake. Someone is rewriting the past, Mr. Goodwin. They are deleting the dead. I left him there to simmer and went to the house phone to buzz the plant rooms." When Wolfe answered, he sounded like a bear that had been poked with a stick during a nap. I gave him the name and the deleting the dead line. There was a long silence, the kind Wolfe uses when he's deciding if a disruption is worth the effort of moving 1/7 of a ton of himself downstairs. "Glynn," Wolfe rumbled finally. "The archivist for the Dutch West India papers. Bring him in. And Archie, check his hands. If he has been handling the Van Huysen ledgers, I want to know if he brought the dust with him when 11 o'clock rolled round and the elevator hummed to life. Glynn was already vibrating with nerves." Wolfe stepped out, crossed the room with his usual deliberate gait, and settled into his custom-made chair. He didn't offer a hand or a greeting. He just stared at Glynn until the little man looked like he wanted to vanish into the upholstery. "You speak of deletion, Mr. Glynn," Wolfe began, his voice a deep, resonant baritone. "Be specific. I have no patience for metaphors before lunch." Glynn fumbled with his portfolio, pulling out a set of photocopies. "For 30 years, I have curated the private archives of the Sterling family. They were the architects of the city's early shipping lanes. Last week, 3 original ledgers from the 1880s vanished from the vault. In their place were forgeries, perfect to the untrained eye. But the ink is wrong. It contains a synthetic binder that didn't exist in 1885. More importantly, 2 investors' names have been excised. It's a surgical removal of an entire branch of a family tree." Wolfe glanced at the copies, his eyes narrowing to slits. I knew that look. It wasn't the theft that interested him, it was the precision of the lie. Wolfe finds an intellectual insult far more offensive than a physical one. "The Sterling family," Wolfe mused, "currently represented by the widow, Beatrice Sterling, and her 3 nephews, a family whose current wealth is built on the perceived purity of its lineage. And you believe these excisions are a prelude to a larger fraud?" "I believe they are a prelude to a murder, Mr. Wolfe," Glynn said, his voice trembling. "Because the 2 names removed were the only ones that could prove the Sterling fortune was built on a massive embezzlement from the city treasury in 1885. Someone is cleaning the slate, and I am the only one who knows the original text." Wolfe leaned back, his fingers starting their rhythmic dance on the arms of his chair. A crime buried in dust resurfacing in the present. "Archie, take Mr. Glynn's statement and find out which of the Sterling nephews has recently developed an interest in antiquarian ink. The sanctity of my office has been disturbed by a ghost, and I find I have a sudden appetite for the hunt. "So you're taking it?" I asked, already reaching for my notebook. "I'm accepting a retainer," Wolfe corrected me, "to preserve the integrity of the record. Tell Fritz to prepare a light lunch. I suspect the archives are not the only thing in the Sterling house that is covered in a layer of deception." As I showed Glynn out, I caught the look in Wolfe's eyes. He wasn't thinking about 1885. He was thinking about the person who thought they were clever enough to deceive him with a synthetic binder. It was going to be an interesting week. The following morning, the atmosphere in the brownstone shifted from its usual state of quiet study to one of crowded, high-voltage apprehension. Wolfe had directed me to summon the key members of the Sterling inner circle for a preliminary inquiry, and by 10 o'clock the front room felt smaller than usual, occupied by 4 individuals who looked as though they had been vacuum-sealed in their own self-importance. Wolfe remained upstairs, a tactical delay he used to let the suspect's nerves marinate in the silence of his office, while I played the role of the watchful sentry. I stood by the office door, leaning against the frame with a casual air that masked a very sharp attention to the way they were interacting, or, more accurately, the way they were pointedly ignoring one another. The air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco, cold perfume, and a very specific kind of old money panic that tends to make people sit too straight and talk too little. First to arrive was Beatrice Sterling, the matriarch and widow of the late Julian Sterling. She was a woman who seemed to be made entirely of frozen velvet and sharp angles. She sat in the red leather chair with a posture so straight it looked painful. Her gloved hands folded over the silver head of a cane she didn't actually seem to need for walking. She hadn't said a word to the others since she entered, treating the room like a royal court where she was the only legitimate sovereign. The 3 nephews were a study in varied degrees of ambition and anxiety. Arthur, the eldest and a current candidate for a sensitive municipal post, was a man whose suits cost more than my first car, but whose eyes had the frantic look of a cornered rabbit. He was pacing the length of the rug, checking a gold watch every 30 seconds. Then there was Lawrence, a man who called himself a private investor but looked more like a professional gambler who had forgotten how to win. He spent the entire wait staring out the window at the rain, his fingers drumming a rhythmic, irritating beat on the windowsill. Finally, there was the youngest, Julian, named after his uncle, a perennial student of historical philosophy who looked like he'd been pulled through a hedge backwards. He was the one who spent the most time in the archives with Glynn, and he was currently staring at the bookshelves as if he were trying to memorize the titles through sheer willpower. The tension in the room was so thick you could have spread it on a cracker. When 11 o'clock rolled around, the elevator hummed to life, and Wolfe stepped out. He didn't offer a greeting. He walked to his oversized chair, performed the complex series of maneuvers required to settle his bulk into the cushions, and looked at the group with the expression of a man who had just found a beetle in his salad. He let the silence stretch for a full minute, his eyes moving from Beatrice to each of the nephews in turn, until Arthur finally broke the stillness. "Mr. Wolfe," Arthur began, his voice a bit too loud for the room, "I trust this won't take long. I have a committee meeting at noon, and this talk of tampered ledgers is an embarrassment. Percival Glynn is a sentimentalist who sees ghosts in every inkblot. My family's history is a matter of public record, not a detective story. If Glynn has misplaced some papers or imagines a smudge is a conspiracy, that is an internal Foundation matter, not a reason to drag us into a private investigation. My campaign cannot afford even the whisper of a scandal, however ancient and imagined it might be." Wolfe shifted his gaze to Arthur, his eyes narrowing to slits. "An embarrassment, Mr. Sterling? I find that a curious choice of words. Most men would call the surgical alteration of their ancestors' records an assault on their identity. To call it an embarrassment suggests that the names being added or removed are ones you were quite happy to see hidden until they became inconvenient. If the record is as pure as you claim, a smudge should be a trifle. Yet here you are, vibrating with indignation like a tuning fork. Beatrice tapped her cane once on the floor, a sharp, metallic sound that cut through Arthur's stuttered protest. Mr. Wolfe, the sterling name, has stood for integrity in this city for over a century. If someone is tampering with our history, they are attacking the very foundation of our political and financial standing. I hired Glynn to protect those papers, not to imagine conspiracies. However, since he has brought his concerns to you, I expect a resolution that does not involve a public spectacle. My nephews are here at my request, but do not mistake their presence for a confession of anything other than a desire to see this settled quietly and efficiently. Spectacles are usually the result of people trying to hide behind curtains that are too small for them, Wolfe rumbled, his voice dropping to a dangerous resonant baritone. Lawrence, you were in the archives last Thursday, were you not? Glynn mentions you were looking for the original contracts for the 1885 harbour expansion. A very specific interest for a man who usually deals in modern equity and high-risk bonds. Lawrence stopped drumming on the window. I was looking for a date, that's all. I'm thinking of writing a family memoir. Is that a crime now? Glynn is senile. He probably misplaced those ledgers himself and is looking for a scapegoat to protect his pension. He's been breathing dust for too long, and it's finally clouded his judgment. And you, Julian? Wolfe turned to the youngest. You are a scholar. You have a deep appreciation for the historical philosophy of your family's rise to power. Does that philosophy include the use of synthetic binders in 19th century ink? Because the forged margins Glynn discovered were executed with a very contemporary chemical composition, one that requires a certain technical proficiency to apply without damaging the original parchment. It is a modern touch on an ancient lie. Julian blinked, his glasses sliding down his nose. Ink? I don't know anything about ink. I was studying the economic impact of the 1880s transition. The ledgers were there when I left. Glynn is exaggerating. He's always been obsessed with the sanctity of the page. It's a professional neurosis he's developed over decades of isolation. Exaggeration is a tool of the poet, Wolfe said, his fingers beginning their rhythmic dance on the arms of his chair. But forgery is the tool of the strategist. Archie, ensure that all 4 of our guests provide their current office addresses to you. And Lawrence, I would like to see that memoir you are writing. It is a rare thing for a private investor to find time for such a nostalgic pursuit, unless the past has suddenly become very profitable in the present. I moved to the desk to take down the details, and I could feel the heat radiating off them. They weren't just suspects, they were intruders who had brought a cold, ancient wind into the office. Beatrice Sterling stood up, her movements stiff and regal. She didn't look at her nephews as she walked toward the door. As I showed them, I caught the look on Wolfe's face. He wasn't thinking about the addresses. He was thinking about the synthetic binder. He was thinking about a man who would go to the trouble of rewriting the dead just to control the living. And I knew, from the way he was staring at the empty space where Beatrice had been sitting, that the brownstone was about to become the center of a very modern war over a very old secret. Archie, Wolfe said, just as I closed the door, follow Julian. A scholar who doesn't know about ink is either a fool or a very careful liar. I suspect Julian is neither, making him the most dangerous of the 3. He has the motive of the academic and the desperation of the youngest son, who has found a way to rewrite his own standing. I grabbed my coat and hat. The legwork was beginning, and the dust of the Sterling archives was starting to settle into a very specific, very deadly pattern. I grabbed my coat and hat, slipping out of the brownstone just as Julian Sterling was disappearing around the corner of 35th Street. He wasn't hard to follow. He had a walk that was half shuffle and half stumble, the kind of gait you develop when you spend too much time in subterranean stacks and not enough time on the pavement. He didn't hail a taxi, which was my first clue that his historical philosophy didn't come with a substantial allowance. Instead, he headed for the subway, leading me on a rattling trip uptown to a neighborhood where the buildings looked like they were holding each other up out of sheer exhaustion. It was a grey, damp afternoon, and the city felt like it was closing in on itself. Julian kept his head down, his chin tucked into the collar of a frayed overcoat, clutching a leather satchel to his ribs as if it contained the crown jewels, or at least a very incriminating sandwich. Julian didn't go to a library, college, or even a bookstore. He stopped at a small, dingy shop squeezed between a laundromat and a deli. The sign above the door was peeling and barely legible, but it said, M. Radovich, Fine Chemicals and Rare Pigments. It wasn't the kind of place Sterling usually frequented, unless they had taken up a very specific and very expensive hobby like high-end forgery or Renaissance-style painting. I waited across the street, leaning against a lamppost and looking like a man who had nowhere better to be, while Julian spent 40 minutes inside. When he came out, he was clutching a small brown paper bag as if it contained the secret to eternal life. He looked left, then right, with the sort of exaggerated caution that practically screams I'm doing something illegal, before scurrying back toward the subway entrance. I didn't follow him further. I had seen enough of Julian for one afternoon to know he wasn't just studying the socio-economics of the 19th century. I waited until he was underground and then crossed the street to pay a visit to M. Radovich. The shop smelled like a chemistry set that had been left out in the rain, sharp, acidic, and vaguely metallic. Radovich was a man who looked like he had been cured in wood smoke, with fingers stained a dozen different colors and eyes that were far too sharp for a peaceful merchant. He was hunched over a brass scale, weighing out a powder that looked like ground-up emeralds. He didn't look up when the bell rang. He just finished his measurement with a steady hand that suggested he didn't care much for interruptions. "Help you?" he asked, his voice a low rasp that didn't sound particularly helpful. "I hope so," I said, flashing my most winning smile. "A friend of mine was just in here, Julian Sterling. Tall, looks like he's missing a few buttons. He's working on a project for me, and he said you were the only man in the city who could supply the specific binder we need for some 1880s restoration work. I wanted to see if I could get a second batch of the same stuff." Radovich stared at me for a long beat, his eyes moving over my suit and my shoes, calculating my worth down to the penny. He wasn't easily impressed by a smile or a sharp coat. "Sterling, yes, he is very particular. But he did not buy a binder today. He came to complain. He says the Prussian blue I sold him last month is reacting poorly with the synthetic resin. He wants a refund, but in this shop there are no refunds for the mistakes of the amateur. If he cannot mix his chemicals to mimic the oxidation of the Victorian era, he should stick to reading his books." "Synthetic resin," I repeated, making a mental note to tell Wolfe. "That's a bit modern for restoration, isn't it? I thought we were aiming for authenticity in our historical preservation." Radovich shrugged, a gesture that suggested he didn't care if his customers were restoring a Rembrandt or forging a banknote as long as the cash was green. He wanted a fast dry and a deep gloss. You get that with synthetics. Now, if you are not buying, you are taking up the air. This is a place of business, not a social club for the curious. I took the hint in the air, heading back toward the brownstone as the city lights began to flicker on. The pieces were starting to clutter the board. Julian was playing with chemistry, Arthur was drowning in political debt, and Lawrence was obsessed with his memoir. Each of them had a motive to prune the family tree, but Julian was the only one with the technical equipment. When I walked into the office, the lights were low, and Wolfe was already in his chair, a bottle of beer at his elbow. He looked at me, and I didn't even have to speak. I just laid my hat on the rack and started talking. I gave him Radovich, the synthetic resin and the Prussian blue. Wolfe listened with his eyes closed, his fingers performing their rhythmic dance on the arms of his chair. "Prussian blue," Wolfe murmured, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "A pigment that gained popularity in the 19th century, but one that is notoriously difficult to stabilize without modern additives if one is attempting to mimic aged ink. Julian is indeed the technician, but Julian lacks the incentive to delete the dead. He is a scholar. He lives for the record, not the erasure of it. There is a contradiction here, Archie, and nature abhors a contradiction. Why would a man who loves history seek to poison its sources?" "Maybe he's being paid," I suggested, sitting at my desk. "Arthur's campaign is a mess. If the Sterling name is linked to a scandal from 1885, the city will pull his nomination faster than you can say embezzlement. He needs the past to be clean so he can build on the future. He has the money and Julian has the skill. Or maybe Lawrence is the one pulling the strings. Gamblers always need a hedge, and a forged memoir is a great way to squeeze his brothers for every cent the estate has left." Wolfe made a sound that might have been a grunt of approval. "The circle is tightening, Archie, but we are missing the catalyst. Glynn said names were cut last week. Why now? The archives have sat undisturbed for a century. Something has changed in the present that makes the past a weapon. We must find the link between a bottle of Prussian blue and the current balance of power in the Sterling household." I reached for the mail that had arrived while I was out. Tucked between a bill from the butcher and a botanical catalogue was a plain white envelope addressed to Wolfe in a cramped, precise hand. I opened it and felt the back of my neck prickle. Inside was a single torn page from a ledger, an original by the look of it, with a heavy line of dark, glossy ink drawn through the centre. Across the bottom, written in the same cramped hand, were the words, "The dead should stay buried." "If you keep digging, Mr. Wolfe, you will join them." I handed the paper to Wolfe. He didn't flinch. He studied the ink, the handwriting, and the threat with a cold, clinical detachment that was more terrifying than a raised voice. "Synthetic resin," Wolfe noted, touching the glossy line. "And a very contemporary threat. It seems the architect of this deception is growing impatient with our interference. They have committed the ultimate error, Archie. They have attempted to intimidate me in my own home. This is no longer merely a matter of historical integrity. It is a matter of professional hygiene." "What's the move?" I asked, my hand moving instinctively toward the drawer where I keep my Colt. "The move," Wolfe said, his voice dropping to a final, authoritative resonance, "is to increase the pressure. Summon Saul Panzer. I want the financial records of every company Julian has consulted for in the last year. And Archie, tell Fritz to prepare the guest room. I suspect Percival Glynn is no longer safe in his cellar. The shadows are no longer just in the margins, they are at the door." As I moved to the phone, I looked at the torn ledger page. The Sterling family was falling apart, and the brownstone was no longer just a place of inquiry. It was a target. Wolfe leaned back, his eyes closing, and I knew the positioning was over. The pressure was about to be applied. In this house, when we turn the screw, someone always screams. The following morning began with a stillness that was entirely too heavy to be natural. I was at my desk by 8, trying to make sense of the financial reports Saul Panzer had dropped off in the middle of the night. Saul had been busy. He'd tracked Julian's movements through every second-hand bookshop and chemistry supply house in the tri-state area. The numbers didn't lie, even if the Sterlings did. Julian Sterling's bank account was a desert, but someone had been irrigating it with small, untraceable cash deposits for months. Wolfe was still upstairs in the plant rooms, and Glynn was tucked away in the guest room, probably dreaming of sentient alphabet soup and leather-bound conspiracies. It was the kind of quiet that usually precedes a loud noise, but in this house, the disruptions are rarely loud. They are calculated, meant to be felt rather than heard, like the slow drip of water on a stone. The first sign that the sanctuary had been breached came when I went to the kitchen for a second pot of coffee. Fritz was standing by the spice rack, looking at a small porcelain jar of saffron as if it had just insulted his ancestors. Fritz is a man who can tell if a grain of salt is out of place. Right now, his eyes are narrowed to slits of genuine distress. He didn't move as I entered, he just pointed a trembling finger at the rack. "Archie," he said, his voice a low, pained whisper. "Someone has been eating the spices. Saffron is not where it belongs. It has been moved 2 inches to the left, and the lid is not tight. I did not do this. I would never do this. It is an impertinence, a violation of the kitchen's order." I didn't laugh. In the brownstone, a moved spice jar is the equivalent of a brick through the window. It means someone has bypassed the locks, the bolts, and my own sharp ears. I checked the service entrance. The bolts were still thrown, and the alarm tape I'd placed on the floor was intact. I checked the front door. Same story. Whoever had been in the kitchen hadn't forced their way in. They were already part of the environment, or they had a key that didn't leave a mark, or perhaps they were just a ghost with a very specific interest in expensive seasonings. I walked back into the office and did a slow, methodical sweep. At first glance, everything looked normal. Then I saw it. The small globe on Wolfe's desk, the one he uses to trace the voyages of his more obscure historical figures, had been rotated. The North Pole was pointing toward the window instead of the bookshelf. I reached for the globe and felt a sliver of paper tucked into the brass meridian. It was a fragment of a hand-drawn map, showing the old waterfront district as it had looked in 1885. Across the back, written in the same glossy synthetic ink we'd seen on the threat, were 4 numbers: September 14th, 2022. "Archie," Wolfe's voice rumbled from the doorway. He had descended early, and he was standing there looking at me with an expression that could have withered a cactus. He didn't look at the globe. He looked at the air in the room as if he could taste the trespass. "You are handling the furniture. It is a disruptive habit, and the scent of adrenaline is clashing with the smell of the beer I haven't poured yet. Why are you disturbing the axis of the earth?" "We've had a visitor, sir," I said, holding up the map fragment. "Fritz found the saffron jar moved, and someone decided to give your globe a spin. They left a set of coordinates and a piece of the 1885 waterfront. I've checked the doors. No signs of forced entry, which means we're dealing with someone who knows their way around a lock or has a very good friend in the locksmith union. Or maybe a sterling who thinks they're being clever by playing on your love for geographic precision." Wolfe crossed the room, his bulk moving with a silent, predatory grace. He didn't take my paper. He sat in his chair, performed the complex maneuver of seating himself, and stared at the spot where the globe had been moved. The surge of cold, focused fury in him was almost visible, like a heat haze over a radiator. To Wolfe, a trespass into this room was a violation of his very being. The fact that someone had breached our perimeter and dared to touch his tools was an affront that required a total demolition of the offender. "A surgical intrusion," Wolfe murmured, his voice dropping to a dangerous, resonant purr. "They did not come to steal, Archie. They came to demonstrate. They wish me to know that my walls are not as thick as I believe, and that the shadows I am hunting are already inside the house. It is a psychological gambit, designed to induce a defensive posture. The numbers, September 14th, 2022, they are not coordinates. They are the combination to a very specific type of vintage vault, the kind the Sterling family used in their private counting house on the docks during the expansion of the 80s. "So they're inviting us to a party?" I asked, leaning against my desk. The map fragment confirms the location. "Someone is inviting us to a discovery. They want you to find the truth they have prepared, so that you may be the one to officially validate their forgery. They're using the brownstone as a pawn in their internal war. They are attempting to," Wolfe corrected, his eyes narrowing to slits of yellow-gold light. "They have made the fatal error of assuming that because I value the record, I am a slave to it." They have disturbed the sanctity of my home to play a game of intellectual hide-and-seek. Archie, call Saul Panzer. I want the history of the Sterling counting house, specifically the names of the men who worked the night shift in February of 1885, and I want to know who has recently purchased a skeleton key designed for a 19th century brownstone. Someone has been very busy while we were watching the front door, and I intend to find out how they reached my spices. You think it's one of the nephews? It is someone with the Sterling blood, Wolfe said, his fingers beginning their rhythmic dance on the arms of his chair. A stranger would have stolen the silver or searched the safe. A Sterling would move a globe and leave a map. It is a gesture of familial arrogance. They believe that even in their crimes they are superior to the environment they inhabit. Increase the surveillance on the house, Archie, and tell Fritz to prepare a dinner that requires no spices from the rack. I will not have my palate insulted by the hand of a trespasser. I spent the rest of the morning on the phone and the rest of the afternoon watching the street from the front window. The pressure was mounting, and the shadows were no longer just in the margins of Glyn's ledgers. They were in the hallway, in the kitchen, and in the very air we breathed. A second betrayal was coming. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, and it wasn't going to be a moved spice jar. It would be a blast. Around 4 o'clock, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. No one got out. It sat there for 10 minutes, the engine idling before sliding away into the grey New York drizzle. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. Wolfe sat in his chair, his eyes closed, his mind already 3 moves ahead of the person who had moved his globe. The positioning was over. The trap was being set, and the brownstone was the bait. I checked the front door lock again. We were ready, but in this business, being ready is usually just the start of the real trouble. The following morning, the atmosphere in the office was as brittle as a century-old broadsheet left in the sun. Wolfe had spent the night in a state of suspended animation, which usually means his brain was working at a velocity that would melt a standard fuse while his body remained perfectly stationary. I was at my desk, my eyes stinging from a marathon session with a magnifying glass and a stack of photocopies Percival Glyn had brought from his guest room. We weren't looking for what was there, we were looking for what had been taken away. The missing margin of the 1885 ledger wasn't just a physical gap. It was a psychological void that someone had gone to great lengths to create. Every entry we analyzed seemed to lead toward a dead end, a deliberate erasure of a name that should have been central to the Sterling fortune and the city's expansion. Archie, Wolfe rumbled, his voice startling me in the quiet room. He hadn't moved for 20 minutes, but now he was leaning forward, his eyes fixed on the map fragment the intruder had left under his globe. The coordinates, September 14th, 2022, and the waterfront fragment, they do not merely point to a location, they point to a silence. In the 1880s, the Sterling counting house was the site of a municipal audit that never reached the public record. The margin that has been removed contained the auditor's initials and a reference to a ledger that does not exist in Glyn's inventory. Someone has surgically excised the only link between the family fortune and the city treasury. They have attempted to make the past as malleable as clay, but they have forgotten that clay, once fired in the kiln of history, becomes brittle. It breaks rather than bends. A ghost ledger, I muttered, leaning back in my chair. It fits the pattern. Julian plays with the chemistry, Lawrence writes the memoir to provide a narrative cover, and Arthur uses his political weight to make sure no one asks questions about the docs. But if the margin is missing, it means the audit evidence is still out there. Maybe in that vault the combination opens. But why the break-in? Why lead us there? If I were hiding a century of embezzlement, the last thing I'd do is leave a map for the one man in New York who can read between the lines. It's like a criminal leaving a calling card at the scene of the crime and then calling the cops to make sure they found it. It feels less like a threat and more like a desperate invitation to a funeral. Because they are desperate, Wolfe suggested, his fingers starting their rhythmic dance on the arms of his chair. The architect of this deception realizes that Glyn's arrival at this house changed the variables. They are not leading us to a discovery, they are attempting to frame a discovery. They want me to find the truth they have prepared, so that I may be the one to officially validate their forgery. They have disturbed the sanctity of my home to play a game of intellectual hide-and-seek. This is an impertinence I will not tolerate. The altered inventory is not a shield for them, it is a confession of their specific fears. They are afraid of what that vault truly contains, and they hope I will provide them with a sanitized version of their own heritage before the city finds the real thing. The front doorbell rang, a sharp, intrusive sound that made Glyn stick his head out of the guest room like a nervous turtle. I went to the door and found Arthur Sterling standing there. He didn't look like a candidate for a municipal post today. He looked like a man who had spent the night in his car. His tie was crooked, and there was a frantic, oscillating light in his eyes that suggested his political future had finally hit a brick wall. He didn't wait to be invited in. He pushed past me and marched into the office, his breathing heavy and ragged. He looked at the globe, then at Wolfe, and finally at the photocopies spread across my desk with a mixture of hatred and relief. "Wolfe," he shouted, stopping in the middle of the rug, "I've had enough. Someone broke into my campaign office last night. They didn't take money. They took the original land grants for the waterfront, the ones that prove the Sterlings owned that land before the 1885 audit. If those are gone, the city will seize the project by noon. I know Glyn is here. I know he's the one who told you where they were. He's been bitter about his salary for years, and now he's trying to burn the house down because he thinks he wasn't invited to the party. Give me the papers, or I'll have the police here in 10 minutes to search this mausoleum. I won't have my career ruined by a dusty old man." Wolfe didn't look up. He didn't even acknowledge Arthur's presence for a full minute, allowing the man's panic to fill the room until it was almost suffocating. "Mr. Sterling," Wolfe said finally, his voice a low, melodic growl, "your office was breached. My office was breached. Both events occurred within the same 6-hour window. Do you truly believe Percival Glyn, a man who requires a nap after climbing a flight of stairs, is capable of such synchronized acrobatics? Or is it more likely that the person who took your land grants is the same person who moved my saffron? You are being steered, sir, like a sheep toward a shearer. You have been stripped of your legal standing so that you will be forced to rely on the discovery that is about to take place at the waterfront." Arthur stopped mid-stride, his mouth hanging open. "What discovery?" "I don't know anything about a discovery. I just want my land grants back. If the audit records are being changed, it's not by me. I'm the one with the most to lose if history is rewritten. Why would I sabotage my own lineage when I'm the one standing on top of it?" "Because your lineage is a fiction," Wolfe snapped, his eyes narrowing to sharp points of light. "Archie, summon Lawrence and Julian. Tell them their brother is here and that the ghost ledger has been located, a lie that will serve as a catalyst. And call Saul Panzer. I want him at the waterfront, at the exact coordinates of the old counting house. If the vault is still there, I want to know who is standing in front of it. We are no longer waiting for the shadows to move. We are going to force them into the light." The altered inventory was the first step, but the final entry will be written in this office. Tell Fritz to prepare coffee. This is going to be a very long afternoon. As I moved to the phone, I watched Arthur. He had slumped into one of the yellow chairs, his face buried in his hands. He wasn't the mastermind. He was the primary victim of a scheme that was far more sophisticated than a simple family squabble. The missing margin was the key, and someone was using it to unlock a door Arthur had spent his whole life trying to keep bolted. The pressure in the room had reached a boiling point, and I knew that before the night was over, the Sterling family would find out that some secrets are better left buried under the docks. Wolfe leaned back, his eyes closing, the positioning complete. I moved down the hallway with the kind of practiced silence that comes from years of navigating a house where every floorboard has its own personality. The air near the service entrance felt different, colder, as if the New York winter had found a way to bypass the stone walls and settle in the joints of the house. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't need to. I knew the geometry of the kitchen by heart, from the height of the butcher block to the exact position of Fritz's favorite copper pans. I kept my back to the wall, the weight of the Colt in my hand a familiar, steadying presence. Through the narrow window of the service door, the shadows of the alleyway were shifting, detached from the brickwork and moving with a deliberate human rhythm. There was a metallic scrape, the sound of a key sliding into a lock that had already been softened by a master. The person on the other side wasn't a common burglar. They were working with the confidence of someone who had practiced this entry a dozen times. As the door began to creak open, I stepped into the spill of grey light, the barrel of my weapon leveled at the center of the dark figure. "Hold it right there," I said, my voice barely a whisper but carrying enough edge to stop a charging bull. "The brownstone is closed for the night, and we've already had enough people moving the furniture. One more step and you'll find out that I'm much less patient than Mr. Wolfe. Keep your hands where the moonlight can find them. Don't even think about reaching for a handkerchief or a lockpick." The figure froze. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw a face that was both familiar and entirely out of place. It wasn't an assassin or a hired thug. It was Marcus, the Sterling family's longtime chauffeur and estate manager, a man who had been the silent background to the family's drama for 30 years. He wasn't carrying a weapon. He was carrying a heavy, rusted iron box, the kind that looks like it belongs in the bilge of an old ship or the bottom of a forgotten grave. He looked at me, then at the gun, and then let out a long, shaky breath that smelled of cheap tobacco and cold air. "Mr. Goodwin," he rasped, his eyes darting toward the office where the muffled sounds of the Sterling brothers arguing still drifted through the air. "I didn't come to hurt anyone. I came to an end. The box, it's the ghost ledger, the one Glynn has been hunting. I've had it in the floorboards of the garage since the night the old man died. He told me to burn it, but a man like me, we don't burn the only insurance we have, not when we know what Sterling's name is worth. I saw your light from the alley and knew it was now or never. The pressure from the nephews was becoming more than a man my age could handle. I didn't lower the gun. Insurance is one thing, Marcus. Breaking into Nero Wolfe's house twice in 48 hours is another. You're the one who moved the saffron and spun the globe, aren't you? You wanted Wolfe to find the coordinates so you could hand over the box without having the Sterling nephews know you were the one who betrayed them. You wanted to be the whistleblower and the victim all at once, playing both sides of the street while you waited for the highest bidder to fail. I knew they'd kill each other over what's inside, Marcus said, his voice trembling. Or worse, they'd kill me to keep it quiet once the waterfront project failed. Mr. Wolfe is the only one who can make it make sense without the city burning down. Please, take it to him. My hands are clean of the ink, even if they're dirty from the grease. I just want out of this family before the walls fall in and crush us all. I marched him down the hall and into the office, the rusty box under my arm. The sight of Marcus entering the room under my guard brought a sudden, violent silence to the Sterling brothers. Arthur surged to his feet, but Saul Panzer, who had slipped in through the service door behind me, caught him by the shoulder and eased him back into his chair with a professional flick of the wrist. Wolfe didn't look at Marcus, he looked at the box. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing to slits as he studied the salt-corroded hinges and the heavy, old-fashioned padlock that held a century of corruption inside. "A second betrayal, Marcus?" Wolfe rumbled, his voice filling the room with a low melodic resonance. "Or merely a delayed one? You have held the truth for 3 decades, watching this family rot from the inside while you waited for the perfect moment to monetize their shame. The shadows in the archives were your doing. You provided Julian with the access and the chemical leads, knowing his amateurish work would eventually draw my attention. You wanted the record disturbed so that you could finally bring the original evidence into the light without being seen as the architect of their ruin. You used a scholar's curiosity to mask a servant's greed, and you used my house as a stage for your final performance. I did what I had to do, Mr. Wolfe, Marcus said, his arrogance returning now that he was inside the circle. The Sterlings haven't been builders for years. They've been a crime syndicate with better tailors. That box contains the 1,885 contracts, the ones signed in blood and bribes. It proves that the shipping empire was built on a foundation of stolen municipal bonds. The rivals they've been trying to erase weren't rivals. They were the witnesses who were buried under the foundations of the new docks. I've spent 30 years driving them to funerals they didn't care about, and I figured it was time someone drove them to the precinct. Office pressure has reached a breaking point. Lawrence lunged for the box, but I stepped in front of him, the barrel of the Colt a sharp reminder of the new management. Arthur looked like he was about to have a stroke, his face a mottled shade of purple, while Julian just slumped over, his head in his hands, finally realizing that his academic pursuits had been a front for a very real and very dirty war. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice dropping to a final authoritative resonance. "The phone. Call Inspector Cramer. Tell him to bring a locksmith and a stenographer. And Archie, tell him to bring the heavy handcuffs. We are no longer dealing with a family squabble or a forged ledger. We are dealing with a 30-year-old extortion that has finally run out of places to hide. The sanctity of this house has been violated lately. Tell Fritz to prepare a pot of coffee. It is going to be a long night for the Sterlings." As I dialed the number for the precinct, I watched the snow begin to fall outside the office window, white and clean, covering the city's grime. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of rusted iron and old sins. The positioning was over. The trap had snapped shut, and the brownstone was once again a sanctuary of the truth, even if the truth was as heavy and ugly as the iron box on my desk. The hours leading up to the final gathering were marked by a strategic stillness that only Nero Wolfe can truly master. While Marcus was being held in the front room under Saul Panzer's watchful eye, the brownstone remained a pocket of calculated calm. Wolfe didn't spend the afternoon pacing or fretting. He spent it in his chair, seemingly motionless, yet his mind was clearly orchestrating a series of timed interventions designed to fray the last remaining nerves of the Sterling brothers. He had me make 3 phone calls, each one a precise jab into a specific vulnerability. The first was to Arthur's lead engineer at the waterfront, the second to Lawrence's primary creditor, and the third to the city's most tenacious architectural critic. We weren't providing answers. We were simply asking questions that made the suspects realize the ground was shifting beneath them before they even reached our door. By the time the clock struck 7, the arrogance that had filled the office during their first visit had been replaced by a thin, brittle desperation that vibrated in the air like a high-tension wire. Wolfe's positioning was a masterclass in psychological warfare. He didn't want the Sterlings to arrive in a state of united defiance. He wanted them arriving as a collection of jagged edges ready to snag on one another at the slightest provocation. He directed Fritz to prepare a tray of snacks that was entirely too formal for the occasion, adding a layer of social discomfort to the mounting legal dread. I watched from my desk as Wolfe sharpened his metaphorical knife, his eyes half closed as he rehearsed the logical steps of the upcoming deconstruction. He was no longer just a private investigator, he was a choreographer of inevitable collapses. He knew that Arthur was terrified of the municipal audit, that Lawrence was drowning in gambling debt, and that Julian was paralyzed by the realization that his own family had compromised his academic integrity. Each brother was a pillar in a rotting house, and Wolfe was about to remove the final support with a single well-placed observation. "Archie," Wolfe rumbled around 7:30 without opening his eyes, the silver lion on the side table. "It is facing the window now, I presume. The orientation must be exact. A man who seeks to navigate a storm must have a fixed point of reference, and the front door is bolted with a heavy bar. We are not welcoming guests tonight, we are admitting witnesses." Fritz is in the kitchen with a thermos of coffee and a very grim expression. He is still taking the moved saffron jar personally. It is a useful energy. It ensures that the service will be flawless and the atmosphere will remain appropriately austere. The intruder made the mistake of thinking my kitchen was a playground. He will find it is a laboratory for his own undoing. "Exactly as you like it, sir," I said, looking over at the side table. The lion was staring at the window as if it were waiting for the snow to stop and the police to arrive. And the office is ready. I've laid out the photocopies of the altered margins next to the rusted iron box. It looks like a high school science fair project for people who enjoy grand larceny. I've even got the combination September 14th, 2022 written in large block letters on the pad. If they weren't nervous before, the sight of their own secret sitting on a mahogany desk should do the trick. Saul is in position by the dining room door, and I've checked the safety on my Colt twice. We're as ready as we're ever going to be, provided the roof doesn't fall in or Inspector Cramer loses his temper before the confession. Wolfe made a sound that might have been a grunt of approval. He spent the next 15 minutes in the plant rooms, a ritual he insists on before any major confrontation. He says the orchids provide a necessary perspective on the transience of human folly, though I suspect he just likes the humidity and the lack of people talking about embezzlement. While he was upstairs, I took the opportunity to check in on Percival Glynn. The old archivist was sitting in the guest room staring at a cup of tea as if he expected it to disclose a hidden history. He looked like a man who had seen his own obituary and found the font size disappointing. He was the one who had started this landslide, and now he was terrified of being buried by it. He kept muttering about the sanctity of the page, a phrase that was starting to lose its charm in a house full of forged ledgers. At 7:45, the first car pulled up to the curb. I didn't need to look out the window to know it was Beatrice Sterling. She arrived alone, her movements as stiff and regal as ever, though there was a new sharp tension in the set of her jaw that hadn't been there yesterday. She didn't wait to be announced. She walked into the office and stood in the center of the rug, her eyes moving over the display of evidence with a look of profound, icy distaste. She didn't speak to me, and she didn't look for Wolfe. She simply waited, a statue of ancient grievances in a room full of new evidence. Arthur and Lawrence arrived 10 minutes later, together but miles apart. They entered the room like two boxers who had accidentally been booked into the same dressing room. Arthur's suit was rumpled, and Lawrence's gold watch was nowhere to be seen, likely a casualty of a phone call he'd received an hour earlier from his creditors. The increased pressure had done its job. The room felt crowded with secrets that were finally ready to be told. Wolfe descended at exactly 8 o'clock, the elevator's hum the only sound in the house. He didn't look at them as he walked to his desk. He sat down, adjusted his bulk with agonizing slowness, and let the silence stretch until the ticking of the clock on the mantel sounded like a hammer on an anvil. He was in total control of the room before he had even uttered a syllable. The suspects were cornered, the evidence was on the table, and the knife was ready. The sanctuary of the brownstone was about to become a courtroom of his own making, and I knew that by the time we reached the final entry, the Sterling name would never be the same again. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice dropping to a final, authoritative resonance. "The iron box. Open the lid. I believe Beatrice and her nephews would like to see the true cost of their waterfront project, as recorded by the man they thought they could buy with a few moved spices and a spun globe. It is time to see which of them is willing to pay the bill for their century of deception. The record is no longer missing, it is merely waiting for its final signature." I stepped to the table, the iron clasp of the box cold under my fingers. The dead were about to have their audience, and in this room, Nero Wolfe was the only judge they recognized. The gathering was complete, the suspects were silent, and the reveal was only moments away. I stepped to the small table and threw back the heavy, iron-bound cover of the box. The sound of rusty parchment hitting the wood was like a gunshot in the small office. The scent of old damp and acidic ink wafted up, filling the room with the smell of a century's worth of secrets. Wolfe didn't look at the book. He kept his eyes fixed on the three Sterling brothers, who were lined up like schoolboys in the principal's office, though with considerably more expensive tailoring and far more to lose. Beatrice Sterling remained in her chair, a statue of regal indifference, but I noticed her fingers were gripping the silver head of her cane tight enough to turn her knuckles white. The stage was set. and Wolfe was about to play the lead with a precision that would have made a diamond cutter look like he was working with a sledgehammer. "The entry for May 14th, 1885, Wolfe began, his voice dropping into that calm, methodical rhythm that usually precedes a total intellectual demolition. "It is a masterpiece of bureaucratic misdirection. It records a payment of $12,000, a staggering sum for the era, to a firm called Vanderbilt and Sons for the transport of stone. On the surface, a mundane business transaction. But when one cross-references this with the municipal land grants Archie retrieved from the Hall of Records, a different geography emerges. Vanderbilt and Sons did not exist in 1885. It was a shell, a phantom created by your grandfather to receive funds from the city treasury. The stone being transported was actually the stolen wealth of the city moved under the cover of night to build a private empire. You have all spent your lives living in the luxury provided by a theft that was never recorded, until now." "My grandfather was a pioneer," Arthur snapped, though his voice lacked its usual booming authority and had taken on a thin, reedy quality. "He built this city when it was nothing but a collection of muddy streets. You're digging up ghosts to distract from the fact that Percival Glynn is a nuisance who misplaced his own files. This fake story is an insult to the sterling legacy. We are not here to be lectured on the accounting errors of the 19th century. We are here to see Glynn prosecuted for his incompetence and for stealing our family's private property. If you have the ledger, give it to us and let us handle our own affairs. The legacy is an insult to the truth, Mr. Sterling," Wolfe said, leaning back and interlacing his fingers over his middle. "The tamperings Julian performed, the use of the synthetic resin and the Prussian blue, were not intended to hide a theft from the past. They were intended to hide the fact that the original entries were already altered in 1886. Julian did not remove investors' names. He deleted the names of the city councilmen who were being paid off to allow the Sterling family to build on land that the city knew was a geological disaster. He wasn't protecting the family honor. He was trying to fix a leak in a dam that had been crumbling for 100 years. He was the technician for a lie that had outlived its usefulness, and he was doing it on your orders, Arthur, to ensure your political nomination remained untainted." Wolfe shifted his gaze to Lawrence, who was trying to look bored but was failing to stop his right foot from tapping a frantic rhythm against the leg of his chair. "And you, Lawrence, you didn't want the memoir for the history. You realized that if the coordinates of the old municipal safe were found, the safe wouldn't contain gold. It would contain the original engineering surveys that proved the entire waterfront district was built on illegal landfill and stolen property. You weren't selling a prospectus for recovered bonds. You were selling a prospectus for a blackmail scheme against your own brother's development project. You wanted Arthur to pay you to keep the safe buried forever, and you used Julian as your instrument because you knew he was desperate for the archive's secret." "That's a lie," Lawrence whispered, though his eyes darted toward the iron-bound ledger as if it were a ticking bomb. "I'm a private investor. I look for opportunities. If the waterfront story is messy, it's not my fault. I was just trying to bring the family story to light. You can't prove I had any interest in blackmail. I was merely exploring the potential value of the family assets." "Is it a lie?" Wolfe asked, his voice a low, melodic purr. "Then why did you meet with the lead engineer of the city's historical commission last Thursday? Why did you offer him a percentage of your memoir royalties in exchange for a delay in the permit review? You were positioning yourself to be the only person who could save Arthur's project, for a price. The subtle trespass in this house, the movement of the saffron and the spinning of my globe, was your move, Lawrence. You planted the map fragment to lead us to Julian, hoping I would expose him as a fraud and thereby discredit any truth he might tell about your own involvement. You used my house as a disposal unit for your brother's reputation and your own debts." The room was deathly still now. Even the clock ticking seemed to have slowed. Wolfe was no longer just talking. He was dismantling their lives with the precision of a surgeon. He turned his attention to Julian, who was huddled in the corner of his chair, looking like a man who had already been convicted. "And Julian, you are perhaps the most tragic of the three. You have a genuine love for the archives, yet you were willing to poison them with synthetic binders and false ink because you needed the money to pay off the Radovic shop. You had been skimming rare pigments and selling them to forgers for months to fund your research. When your brothers began to press you for the coordinates of the safe, you panicked. You tried to forge the coordinates to lead them to a sewer main, hoping they would give up the search and leave the archives in peace. You weren't protecting the past, you were trying to survive the present, and you were willing to destroy the very record you claimed to worship. Wolfe paused, taking a slow sip of the beer Fritz had placed at his elbow. He let the weight of his words settle over them, a heavy, suffocating blanket of revealed truth. Beatrice Sterling finally spoke, her voice like a thin blade of ice cutting through the warmth of the room. "And what of the box, Mr. Wolfe? You speak of silt and landfill. Is that all my family name is built upon? A swamp and a bribe? If you have the ledger, you have the proof of our ruin. But you also have Marcus. He is the one who brought you the box. He is the one who claims he was protecting us. What is his place in this deconstruction?" "No, madam," Wolfe said, his voice dropping to a final, authoritative resonance. "Your family name is built on a choice, choosing to keep the secret or face the truth. The safe is not on the waterfront. It was moved in 1895 when the old Stirling Manor was demolished. It is currently in the cellar of the Stirling Archives beneath the very floorboards where Percival Glynn has sat for 30 years. Arthur and Lawrence were digging in the wrong place because Julian gave them the coordinates for the original 1885 site, knowing full well the safe had been moved 40 years later. But the man who truly moved the Silver Lion isn't Julian, and it isn't Lawrence. Orchestrating this final confrontation belongs to someone much more patient. Arthur and Lawrence both surged forward in their chairs, but Saul Panzer moved a half-step closer to the desk, and they froze. The deconstruction was complete. Wolfe had laid out the motives, the methods, and the absolute folly of their collective greed. "Archie," Wolfe said without looking at me, "the iron-bound ledger, close it. The dead have finished their testimony. It is time for the living to decide how they wish to pay their debts. Mr. Sterling, the district attorney, is already reviewing the land grants you thought were hidden. The truth, it seems, has its own gravity, and tonight it has landed in this office. Tell Inspector Cramer we are ready for him." I slapped the ledger shut. The iron clasp rang out like a gavel, and the dust of 1885 settled once more. The gathering was over, and for the first time in a century, the Sterlings were out of time and out of lies. The heavy silence that followed the ledger closing was not the peaceful kind. It was the suffocating atmospheric pressure that settles over a courtroom just after a death sentence has been read. Wolfe sat behind his desk, a mountain of yellow-shirted justice, looking at the three nephews with a clinical detachment that was more terrifying than a raised voice. He didn't look like a man who had just solved a mystery. He looked like a man who had just finished a particularly tedious chore, and was now waiting for the trash to be collected. Arthur was a huddle of expensive wool and grey defeat. Lawrence was staring at his own hands as if he'd never seen them before, and Julian was vibrating with a low-frequency terror that threatened to shake the spectacles right off his nose. The Sterling brothers were broken, but the man who had truly orchestrated their collapse had not yet been fully unmasked, and the tension in the room remained as taut as a piano wire. "The mastermind of this affair," Wolfe began, his voice dropping to a low melodic resonance that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards, "is not a man of action. He is a man of the record. He is someone who understood that in a world built on paper, the person who controls the ink controls reality itself. Arthur, you were too blunt. Lawrence, you were too greedy. But the person who truly manipulated this entire sequence of events, from the first excision in the archives to the subtle trespass in this house, is the one person who stood to gain not just money, but an absolute unshakable power over the Sterling legacy, a person who has lived in the shadows of this family for decades, waiting for the perfect moment to call in a century of debts. This individual did not want the secret to stay buried. He wanted it excavated under his own supervision so that he could dictate the terms of the family's survival. Wolfe's gaze shifted, moving slowly across the semicircle until it landed, unexpectedly, on the person who hadn't moved a muscle since the ledger had been closed. He looked at Percival Glynn, the little archivist who had been sitting in the corner like a dusty ghost, suddenly seemed to sharpen. The stoop in his shoulders vanished, and the watery eyes behind his spectacles cleared into something hard, cold, and calculating. He didn't look like a victim anymore. He looked like a king who had finally decided to reveal his crown. The transition was so abrupt it made the back of my neck prickle. Glynn wasn't the prey, he was the hunter who had been camouflaged by his own insignificance. "Mr. Glynn," Wolfe said softly, the tone more dangerous for its lack of volume. "You said you were the keeper of history. You told me you wanted to protect the dead. But you are the one who excised the names. You are the one who provided Julian with the synthetic resin, knowing his amateurish work would eventually be discovered. You didn't want the secret buried, you wanted it found, but only on your terms. You are the one who moved the safe to the cellar in 1895, or rather your father did, and you have spent 30 years sitting on top of it, waiting for the Sterling nephews to grow desperate enough to be milked like cattle. You were the ghost in the machine directing their panic to suit your own ends. You used the sanctity of the archives as blind to your own extortion." Glynn didn't flinch. He let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like parchment tearing in a quiet room. "They were vultures, Mr. Wolfe. All of them. Arthur with his bulldozers and Lawrence with his gambling debts. They did not care about history. They only cared about what it could buy today. I've spent my life in that cellar, breathing their dust and protecting their lies, while they lived in mansions built on a swamp. Why shouldn't I be the one to decide when the debt is called in? I am the only one who truly knows what happened in 1885. I didn't steal the fact, Mr. Wolfe, I owned it, and ownership has its privileges. I brought the case to you not to solve it, but to validate the evidence I had already prepared. I needed a name like yours to make the brothers believe they were truly finished. You are a blackmailer, Mr. Glynn, not a historian," Wolfe snapped, his eyes flashing with a cold, sharp light. "The note sent to this office was your work. The saffron movement and my globe spinning was your motion. You were the only one who knew the layout of this house well enough to enter through the service tunnels, a layout you studied from the original architectural plans in the Sterling archives, which were drawn by the same firm that built this brownstone. You wanted me to expose the brothers' greed so that you could appear as the innocent victim, the loyal servant who had been forced to reveal the truth. You expected me to hand you the keys to the safe as a reward for your integrity, giving you the physical evidence you needed to bleed the family for the next 20 years. You mistook my office for a clearinghouse for your extortion." Glynn stood up, and for a moment he looked significantly taller than he had when he first entered the brownstone. "And what if I did? The records are mine. I have the originals. I have proof of bribery, engineering reports, and municipal safe coordinates. Without me, the Sterling name is just a story told to children. I am the history, Wolfe, not these 3 idiots who can't even balance a checkbook without a lawyer. I deserve to be the one in the red chair, not a relic in a basement. You were meant to be my instrument of justice, the final seal on my victory. You are a footnote," Wolfe said, his voice dropping to a final, authoritative resonance that ended the discussion, "and a smudge. Archie, the phone. Tell Inspector Cramer that the man who broke into this house is currently in my office. Tell him he will also find a collection of stolen municipal records in a false-bottomed trunk in the Sterling cellar. And Archie, tell him to bring the heavy handcuffs. Mr. Glynn has a very firm grip on things that don't belong to him, and I find his presence in this room an intolerable contamination of my air. Tell Fritz that the dining room will be required in 30 minutes. I have a profound distaste for the scent of a blackmailer, and I require the comfort of a well-prepared meal to cleanse the palate of this family's decay." Before I could reach the phone, Beatrice Sterling stood up. She walked over to Glynn and looked him in the eye for a long, silent minute, her face a mask of frozen velvet. Then, without a word, she turned to Wolfe. "Mr. Wolfe, the safe will be opened tomorrow morning in the presence of the city authorities. The Sterling family will face the consequences of the 1885 report. My nephews will surrender their interests in the estate to a charitable trust, or I shall personally see to it that they are prosecuted for the forgeries Julian created under their direction. The archives will be donated to the New York Public Library. The dust, it seems, has finally settled on my husband's legacy. We shall not be blackmailed by the ghosts of our own making." "A wise decision," Madame Wolfe remarked, watching as Glyn's face crumpled from arrogance back into the grey mask of an old man as Saul Panzer moved to block his path to the door. "The truth is a heavy burden, but it is the only one that doesn't grow heavier with time. Justice is not always found in court. Sometimes it is in the simple act of letting the records speak for themselves. Archie, the phone. I believe the inspector is waiting for our call, and I have no desire to keep him from his duty." As I dialed the number for the precinct, I watched the snow begin to fall outside the office window, white and clean, covering the city's grime. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of rusted iron and old sins. The positioning was over. The trap had closed, and the brownstone was once again a sanctuary of the truth. Glyn was led away in silence, his portfolio of lies finally empty. Wolfe leaned back, his eyes closing, the intellectual labour of the day finished. The Sterlings were ruined, the archivist was in custody, and the dead of 1885 were finally at peace, their record finally corrected by a man who values the truth above all else. The following morning, the brownstone had returned to its customary state of clockwork tranquility, a condition that Wolfe guards with more ferocity than a dragon guards its hoard. The New York sun was trying its best to penetrate the office windows, casting long, clean rectangles across the Persian rug where the Sterling nephews had stood in their expensive, rumpled defeat less than 24 hours ago. I was at my desk, the typewriter clacking a steady rhythm as I finished the final report for the files. It is a ritual we have. Once the shouting stops and the handcuffs click, I put it all down on paper so Wolfe can forget about it, and I can remember why we are still in business. The ivory tower of the Sterling Foundation had turned out to be a den of thieves, but the ledger was balanced, the city's history was salvaged, and the orchids upstairs were finally getting the undivided attention they demanded from the man who prefers them to people. Wolfe had been in the plant room since 9, probably apologizing to Miltonia for the intrusion of a criminal investigation. At exactly 11 o'clock the elevator hummed and the door slid open. Wolfe stepped out, looking like a well-fed mountain in a fresh yellow silk vest that was bright enough to require sunglasses. He crossed the room to his oversized chair, performed the complex maneuver of seating himself, and looked at me with an expression that was almost, but not quite, pleasant. He didn't speak immediately. He just adjusted his bulk and let the silence of the room settle around him like a comfortable blanket. The disruption was over. The sanctuary was restored, and the only thing left to settle was the final philosophical accounting of the mess we had just mopped up. "The report is finished, I assume?" he asked, his voice returning to its usual deep, resonant rumble, free of the sharp inquisitorial edge it had carried during the office gathering. "Just typing the period on the last sentence," I said, sliding the folder into the top drawer and turning the key with a satisfying click. "The district attorney's office called an hour ago. They've got Glyn in a cell, and he's already trying to argue that his blackmail was a form of historical reparations for a lifetime of underpaid service. The original 1885 audit papers were found exactly where you predicted, in the false bottom of his trunk in the Sterling cellar. The city's historical commission sent over a letter of thanks that's so full of academic jargon I needed a dictionary to find the thank you part. But the check was in English, and the numbers were clear. It seems the Sterling legacy is being rebranded as the Truth of the Docks exhibit, and Arthur's political career has been buried deeper than that old safe." Wolfe made a sound that might have been a grunt of approval. The Commission's gratitude is as hollow as their previous oversight. They are not thankful for the truth. They are thankful for the containment of a scandal that would have made them look like fools. They would have been just as happy to see the history erased if it could have been done without the police on their doorstep. They are people who value the appearance of integrity more than the substance of it. They treat the past like a guest who must be dressed in a tuxedo before being allowed into the parlor, regardless of whether the guest is a saint or a swindler. Mr. Glyn's error was not his greed, which is a common enough human failing, but his belief that the record was his to manipulate. He forgot that a fact is an immutable thing. It may be obscured, but it cannot be destroyed. And the nephews? I asked, leaning back in my chair and watching the dust motes dance in the sunlight. I dropped Julian off at the university library this morning. He looked like a man who had just found $100 in an old coat pocket, but lost his house in the process. He's back in the stacks, helping them sort through the mess Glyn left behind. He says it's going to take him years to fix the catalogue. He's already ordered a new set of magnifying glasses and a gallon of specialized ink remover that doesn't contain synthetic resins. He seemed almost happy to be away from his brothers and back with the paper. Wolfe shifted his gaze to the small globe on his desk, the one that had been rotated by a trespasser in the night. Identity, Archie, is a fragile construction. We spend our lives building a persona out of paper, names, and expectations, yet the soul remains a stubborn, uncopyable thing. Percival Glyn spent 40 years being a ghost in a library, yet he was more real in his malice than any of the Sterling nephews, who had all the proper credentials and not a shred of honor. They believed that because they could replicate ink and parchment, they could replicate the truth. They discovered, at a significant cost to their bank accounts and their reputations, that the truth has a weight that no forgery can carry. Even the most clever synthetic binder will eventually crack under the pressure of reality. He also discovered that you don't like it when people touch your globe, I quipped, reaching for my own coffee, which Fritz had just brought in. Wolfe's eyes narrowed slightly, a sign of a rare, dry amusement that he rarely allows himself. That was his most egregious error. A man who violates the sanctity of another's workspace reveals a fundamental lack of respect for the order of the universe. It is a symptom of a disordered mind. Glyn sought to move the world to suit his greed, and instead, he moved himself directly into a prison cell. It is a satisfying symmetry. He thought he was playing a game of shadows, but he forgot that shadows cannot exist without a light to define them. We merely provided the light, and the shadows vanished, as they always do when confronted with a superior intellect and a fixed point of reference. Fritz appeared in the doorway, announcing that lunch was served with a bow that suggested the saffron jar had been thoroughly vindicated. We moved into the dining room, where the table was set with its usual impeccable grace. The menu was a simple but elegant omelette aux fines herbes, followed by a salad of watercress that looked as fresh as the morning air. There wasn't a blue ink smudge or a stolen manuscript in sight. As Wolfe took his first bite, a look of profound satisfaction spread across his face. A man who had successfully defended his borders and restored the sanctity of his house. The historian's dangerous discovery had been brought into the light, and for the first time in a week, the only thing being weighed in the office was the quality of the meal and the precision of the afternoon schedule. "Archie," Wolfe said, just as I was reaching for the salad tongs, "Sir, remind me to tell Theodore that the Miltonia in the north window requires more humidity. It is becoming as brittle as Arthur Sterling's excuses for his family's maritime thefts. And Archie, see to it that the globe is polished. I find the fingerprints of a blackmailer particularly distasteful on the North Pole." I grinned and kept eating. The true north of the brownstone had been found, and it pointed, as always, toward the kitchen and the plant rooms. The case of the secret buried in the stacks was officially closed. The record was corrected, and Nero Wolfe was back to the only business that truly mattered, the pursuit of perfection in a world that usually settles for a forgery. The brownstone was at peace, the ledger was balanced, and the past was finally where it belonged, behind us.